And most poker players believe winning tournaments comes down to the cards you're dealt, the luck you run, or how well you memorize some charts. They grind, they study a little, they run good sometimes and crash other times, and they never really understand why. But there is one coach in the world who has spent over 2 decades quietly building a system that changes how players think about every single decision in a tournament. A system that has produced hundreds of winning students and helped one man go from a $50 deposit to over $9 million in live tournament earnings. That man is Jonathan Little, 2-time World Poker Tour champion, WSOP bracelet winner, author of 15 books, voted GPI Poker Personality of the Year, and the founder of one of the most respected poker coaching platforms on the planet. Most players watch his videos. They enjoy the hand breakdowns, they nod along, but they never actually absorb the deeper system underneath every single lesson he teaches. They see the moves. They miss the architecture. Today we're going to break that architecture wide open. We're going to go beyond the individual hand and into the complete tournament philosophy Jonathan Little has built over a career that most players can only dream about. By the end of this video, you will look at a tournament table differently. You will think about stack sizes differently. You will understand why your opponents are making money and you're not. And you will have a framework that most recreational players will spend years trying to find on their own. Let's begin. Because the first concept Little teaches changes the entire way you observe a poker table, and most players have never been taught to do it properly. Jonathan Little has a phrase he uses constantly across his books, his courses, and his coaching sessions. He says, don't just think your opponent is bad, quantify exactly how they're bad. This single idea separates serious students from casual players more than any hand chart ever could. Here is what most players do at the table. They glance at an opponent, decide they're either good or bad, and then play a generic strategy against them. They see someone limp in from early position and think, loose player, and that's the end of the analysis. They never go deeper. Here's what Jonathan Little does. He watches, he processes, and he builds a specific model of every single mistake his opponent is making. Not just that they play too many hands, but exactly which hands, in which positions, and then what they do wrong on each street. He breaks it down like a surgeon. He teaches his students to think in sentences. Not this player is bad, but this player calls too wide pre-flop and on the flop, then folds almost every time the turn is bet. That means every time he calls my continuation bet, I should fire the turn. That's not just observation. That's a system for printing money from a specific leak. The same logic applies to tight players. Little teaches his students to identify the player who folds their big blind to a raise almost every single time, and then to adjust the raise size precisely to exploit that. Raise to 2.2 big blinds, they fold. Raise to 2.0, they call. Most players never notice this distinction. Jonathan Little teaches you to build a table full of these distinctions and act on every single one. This is why Little says you must pay attention even when you're not in the hand. He admits freely that he writes down notes on every hand he witnesses. He gets teased for it. He doesn't care. Because the player who builds the most accurate model of the table is the player who builds the biggest stack. What comes next is the framework Jonathan Little uses to adjust his entire strategy based on a single number. And once you understand it, you'll never look at a stack size the same way again. One of the most fundamental pillars of Jonathan Little's tournament system is stack depth awareness, not as a vague concept, as a precise, structured framework that dictates almost every decision he makes at the table. In his landmark book, Secrets of Professional Tournament Poker, Little divides tournament strategy into clearly defined stack depth zones: deep stacked, generally above 50 big blinds; mid stacked, between 27 and 50 big blinds; short stacked, below 27 big blinds. And each zone requires a completely different set of strategies, mindsets, and adjustments. When you're deep stacked, you're playing a game of implied odds and position. You can see more flops with speculative hands. You can slow play monsters. You can run multi-street bluffs. You have room to maneuver. Little teaches that at deep stacks, position becomes king. Every decision should be filtered through the lens of who has position and who doesn't, because with hundreds of big blinds behind, the player with position has an enormous amount of leverage over every street. When you move into the mid-stack zone, the game shifts dramatically. Now players are frequently committing to pots before the flop or on the flop, and the decision tree compresses. Little teaches that many hands that were profitable to play deep become losing plays mid-stack. The implied odds no longer justify the investment. Your decisions become sharper, more binary, more focused on the fundamental question: am I shoving? Am I calling a shove? Or am I folding? When you drop below 27 big blinds, the entire game changes again. Little is explicit about this. At short stack, the game is almost entirely pre-flop. Your post-flop maneuverability is gone. Now it's about shoving ranges, calling ranges, and understanding which hands generate the most fold equity when you move all in. This is a precise mathematical zone, and Little treats it that way. He studies it, drills it, and teaches his students to know their short stack ranges cold, because in tournaments every player passes through this zone at some point, and most lose everything in it because they've never prepared. The danger zone that kills most players is the transition point between mid and short stack. This is where players make the catastrophic mistake of playing like they have position and options, when in reality they're working with a compressed stack that demands a clear, committed strategy. Little calls this playing intelligently. Old school players called it changing gears. Whatever you call it, the players who master this adjustment are the ones who survive the middle stages when everyone else is busting out. But understanding stack depth is only half the equation, and the other half is something that most players treat as an afterthought right up until the moment the bubble hits, and then it's too late. Before we go deeper into Jonathan Little's system, and what comes next on the bubble is something that completely changes how you approach the most stressful part of any tournament. Let me share something with you. If you've been watching this channel and you know you're serious about your game, we've put together a complete poker strategy collection specifically designed to help players build the kind of framework Jonathan Little talks about. 10 advanced books covering poker math, variance, mental game, psychology, decision-making, and aggressive tournament strategy. Everything a dedicated student needs under one roof. Each book is available individually on Amazon for $9.99. But right now, for a limited time, you can access the complete collection for just $29.90. This is the launch promotion, and the link is in the pinned comment below. If you want to accelerate your learning and build a real system, not just collect random tips, go check it out right now. Now, back to Jonathan Little, and the concept that separates players who cash from players who win. The bubble. That moment in every tournament where the field is about to shrink to the money, where tension rises, where some players freeze and others feast. Most recreational players see the bubble as a time to survive. Jonathan Little sees it as one of the most profitable opportunities in all of tournament poker. His teaching on bubble play is both technical and psychological, and it starts with a single principle. Your strategy on the bubble depends entirely on what your opponents are doing on the bubble. Little teaches his students to scan the table before making any bubble adjustments. If your opponents are tightening up dramatically, which most recreational players do, then you should be attacking relentlessly, stealing blinds, 3-betting light, applying pressure with wider ranges because the fold equity is through the roof. When players are terrified of busting on the bubble, they will fold hands they should never fold. And you should be the one collecting those folds. But here's where most players make the mistake of treating bubble strategy as one size fits all. They read that they should be aggressive on the bubble, they show up at the table firing every hand, and then they run into a short stack who is pot committed and has to call, or a big stack who has been waiting for exactly this over-aggression to trap them. Little is very specific. You need to know who is scared and who isn't. You need to know who the short stacks are and whether they have enough chips to fold, or whether they're already committed to their next hand being an all-in. You need to understand that bubble aggression is targeted, not random. He also teaches from the other side of the chip distribution. If you are the short stack on the bubble, surviving isn't the goal. Making correct EV decisions is the goal. Sometimes the correct decision is to shove your short stack and gamble. Not because it feels brave, but because folding is even more expensive. Little is ruthlessly anti-sentimental about this. Laddering up one pay jump by folding when you should shove costs you expected value. Real money. Every time. And this leads directly into the most intellectually powerful concept in Jonathan Little's entire system. The one that most players understand at a surface level, and almost none of them apply correctly at the table. ICM, the independent chip model. Three letters that represent one of the most important frameworks in all of tournament poker, and one of the most misunderstood. Jonathan Little has built significant portions of his teaching career around helping players understand not just what ICM is, but how it should actually change decisions in real time at the table. Here is the core idea. In a tournament, chips are not worth their face value. The relationship between chips and real money is nonlinear because the prize pool is distributed unevenly. First place gets a disproportionately large payout. Last payout gets significantly less than first. And this nonlinearity creates a situation where doubling your chip stack does not double your expected prize money. In many spots, winning a coin flip that would increase your stack dramatically is not worth the risk of losing your entire tournament life. Most players know this in theory. Almost none of them feel it in the moment. And Little's system is designed to make that feeling instinctive. What ICM means practically is that a chip leader at a final table has an almost supernatural power, not just because of chip count, but because every other player at that table is now playing with ICM pressure. They're thinking about pay jumps, about the difference between third and fourth place, about all the hours they've put in to get here. Little teaches his chip leaders to weaponize this pressure systematically. Attack medium stacks who are trying to ladder up. Apply pressure to players who are watching the short stack bust before they get involved. Force decisions that mathematically your opponents cannot afford to take. But he also teaches the flip side with equal precision. If you're the short stack with ICM pressure bearing down on you, there is a specific set of hands and stack sizes where you must push back, even against players who have the chips to call you off. And if you're in the middle of the pack at a final table, ICM demands a kind of careful selectivity that looks almost passive from the outside, but is in fact a deeply calculated strategy to protect equity while waiting for the right spots to accumulate chips. What comes next is where Jonathan Little's thinking becomes genuinely dangerous, because it goes against everything most players have been taught about how to bluff. Bluffing is one of the most misunderstood skills in poker. Most players either bluff too randomly or not enough, and both mistakes are expensive. Jonathan Little's approach to bluffing is one of the most structured and principled in the game, and it starts with a question that most players never ask. What are the actual reasons to bet in this spot? Little teaches that there are only a handful of legitimate reasons to put chips in the pot. To get value from worse hands, to get better hands to fold, to deny equity to draws, or to set up a future street. Any bet that doesn't serve one of those functions is a leak. And most bluffs that amateur players make fail because they never identify which function the bluff is supposed to serve before they make it. In his book on bluffing, Little goes into surgical detail about what makes a bluff profitable. Position matters enormously. The board texture must favor your perceived range. The opponent's tendencies must create the fold equity you need. The stack sizes must support the story you're telling. And the bet sizing must match the purpose. A bluff designed to fold out a marginal made hand needs a very different size than a bluff designed to represent a specific hand on a specific board. He teaches one of his most important principles through the concept of representing something credible. Every bluff tells a story, and the story has to make sense given everything that's happened in the hand. If you raised pre-flop from early position, bet the flop, and now you're betting a paired board on the river. That story makes sense. You might have a set. You might have a full house. Your opponent can tell themselves a story that justifies a fold. But if you've been passive, you check the flop, you check the turn, and now suddenly you're firing a massive river bet, the story doesn't hold up. Observant players will see through it. Little also teaches the value of image management in making bluffs more effective. The tight player who has shown down premium hands all day has a very different bluffing dynamic than the player who has been running wild. Both can bluff profitably, but they need to do it at different frequencies, with different sizing, and in different spots. Most players ignore image entirely. Little builds it deliberately, but even the perfect bluff fails sometimes. And that's where the next piece of his system comes in. The mental framework that keeps a player executing correctly even when results are working against them. Jonathan Little has spent years thinking about the mental side of poker, and not just in the abstract motivational sense. He approaches it with the same structured precision he brings to hand analysis. He wants to know exactly what is going wrong in a player's mental game and exactly what to fix. One of the core mental principles in his system is simple but difficult to implement. Stop being results-oriented, not as a feel-good mantra, as a literal framework for evaluating decisions. A decision is good or bad based on the information available at the time it was made, not based on whether it worked out. That's the standard. This sounds obvious. It is almost never practiced. The player who runs a perfect bluff that gets called by a strange hand immediately starts questioning whether the bluff was correct. The player who makes a crying call with a marginal hand that happens to be good starts thinking they made a great read. Neither of these responses is accurate, and both lead to progressively worse decision-making over time. Little's solution is what he calls decision review. After a session, not during it, you go back through the hands that were difficult. You ask the question, given what I knew at the time, what was the highest EV play? You separate the evaluation of the decision from the evaluation of the outcome. This practice, done consistently, is what builds genuine intuition, not the fake intuition of someone who has been playing for years without reflection. Real intuition, the kind that makes the right play feel obvious in real time, because you've drilled the analysis of similar situations hundreds of times. He also addresses something that many coaches avoid talking about directly: the psychological cost of running bad. Little is honest about this. Downswings are painful. Losing sessions affect focus. The mental toll of making correct decisions and getting punished for them repeatedly is real. His advice is not to pretend it doesn't affect you. It's to build structural habits that protect your decision quality, even when your emotional state is compromised. The study routine. The session length limits. The stop-loss rules that prevent one bad hour from becoming a catastrophic session. These are mental game tools. Most players view them as optional extras. Little treats them as the foundation. What comes next connects everything we've discussed into the single framework that Jonathan Little uses to evaluate any tournament situation in real time. At the heart of Jonathan Little's system is what he calls thinking through the hand. Not thinking about your cards, thinking through the entire situation, your hand, your opponent's range, what your opponent thinks your range is, the stack sizes, the blind levels, the position, the ICM pressure, the image you've built, and the prize structure. He writes about this explicitly. The number of things you need to process in a single poker decision is enormous, and the goal of serious study is to make as many of those things as possible automatic, so that your conscious mind is free to focus on the pieces that require real-time creative thinking. This is why Little invests so heavily in GTO as the foundation of his system. Not because he thinks players should play robotically according to a solver, but because a player who deeply understands game theory, optimal strategy, has an accurate baseline from which to make intelligent departures. You can't exploit your opponent's mistakes if you don't know what the correct play is in the first place. You can't know when to deviate from a standard line unless you understand the standard line well enough to have internalized it. His teaching process reflects this. He drills fundamentals, range construction, pot odds, continuation betting frequencies, until they become second nature. Then he layers on top the exploitative adjustments that generate the real edge in actual games. Learn GTO, understand it deeply, then adjust away from it systematically when your opponents give you reason to. He applies this same framework to bet sizing. Most players pick one or two bet sizes and use them in nearly every situation. Little teaches that bet sizing is information, and that varying your sizing based on board texture, stack depth, opponent tendencies, and what story you want to tell is one of the highest value skills in tournament poker. A small bet on a connected board tells a different story than a large one. A large bet in a 3-bet pot communicates something very specific about your range. These are not arbitrary choices. They are architectural decisions that shape every street that follows. Once you start processing the game this way, something begins to shift. The table stops looking random. It starts looking like a map, with specific players, specific mistakes, specific pressure points, and once you can read that map, the path to the final table becomes much clearer. This leads to the final piece of the system, the one Jonathan Little considers non-negotiable for long-term success in tournaments, and it might surprise you. If you've been watching this video and you're feeling that shift, that sense that the game is bigger than you thought and you want to go deeper into it, I want to point you towards something. The complete poker strategy collection this channel has put together was built for exactly this moment. 10 books covering everything from the mathematical foundations of winning play to the mental game frameworks that protect your decisions under pressure. Advanced tournament strategy, aggressive play systems, decision-making psychology, everything connecting to everything else. You can get each book individually on Amazon for $9.99. Or you can access the complete collection right now for $29.90, a limited time price that's there because we want serious players to build complete systems rather than random knowledge. The link is in the pinned comment. Check it out. Now, the final piece of Jonathan Little's system, and the reason he keeps winning when others have stopped improving. Jonathan Little started with $50. He turned it into $350,000 before he was 21 years old by grinding online sit-and-go tournaments, over 50,000 of them. Then he moved to live tournaments and won 2 WPT titles, each worth over $1 million. Then a WSOP bracelet, 3 Poker Go Tour titles, consistent final tables across more than 2 decades of professional play. This is not a story of natural talent alone. Jonathan Little is talented, but he is famous in poker not for his genius at the table, but for his dedication to the craft away from it. He writes books, 15 of them. He reviews hands obsessively. He studies solver outputs and integrates them into his teaching. He builds training programs. He coaches students at every level. He is, by any reasonable definition, a student of the game who has never stopped being a student of the game. And that is the final, non-negotiable piece of his system. The commitment to continuous, structured improvement that doesn't stop just because results are good. He teaches his students the same discipline. Study away from the table. Review sessions. Identify leaks. Drill specific spots until they become automatic. Build the knowledge framework that makes real-time decisions easier, not by memorizing every situation, but by developing the pattern recognition that comes from having worked through thousands of situations in structured study environments. He also teaches something that most successful players know but rarely say out loud. The most important study you can do is the study of your own mistakes, not the mistakes in the hands you lost, the mistakes in the hands you won. Because when you lose, the pain motivates analysis. When you win, you feel good and move on. But winning hands often contain the most expensive mistakes. The overbet value hand that got lucky to get called, the marginal call that happened to be right, the bluff that worked despite being poorly constructed. These are the leaks that go undetected for years because results never force you to examine them. Little forces the examination. That's the entire philosophy. Force the examination of every decision. Separate it from the outcome. Build an honest picture of where your poker is and where it needs to go, and then commit to the work of actually getting there. This is what separates players who plateau from players who keep climbing. Not talent, not luck, not running good at the right time. The willingness to look honestly at the game, to build a complete system rather than a collection of tips, and to keep improving even when everything is going well. Poker rewards that mindset. It punishes everything else over time. The player who studies, who quantifies, who adjusts, who thinks deeply about every tournament stage, who respects the math and respects the mental game and respects the work required to keep improving. That player does not just survive tournaments, they win them. That is Jonathan Little's system, not a trick, not a shortcut. A complete architecture for tournament success built over 2 decades of the highest level play this game has to offer. If this video gave you something real, like it. Share it with a player in your circle who is serious about improving. Subscribe to Mind of a Grinder. We will keep building this framework together, one concept at a time, and go to the table knowing that the player with the most complete system always has an edge. Build yours.